on dismantling online power structures and reclaiming the power to regulate our content online. I understand that you had many other brilliant sessions to choose from, so it makes me extremely happy that you've chosen our session, and thank you so much for joining. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers today, and before we start, a note to the participants. We intend on this being as much as a conversation between the four of us as between all of you. So throughout the session, please feel free to drop in your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them and bring them up to the discussion table. A note that the Chatham House rules are in place, so your name and affiliation will not be shared if you do not wish for it to be. But if you are comfortable in doing so, please put in your name and institutional affiliation into the chat box, and we'll be happy to keep that context in mind. So over the last few years, the power that social media platforms yield has come to the fore. The Cambridge Analytica revelations in 2016 showed us the impact that social media platforms can have on our democratic processes and elections. The suspension of President Trump's Twitter account showed us the power that platforms have even when dealing with heads of state. And the revelations of Frances Haugen last year showed us the power that platforms have in impacting the physical and mental health of our teenagers. There is no denying that the internet is no longer the democratic space that it used to be. 43% of all internet traffic today flows through 6 tech platforms and its subsidiaries: Google, Netflix, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon. Undoubtedly, this makes platforms de facto gatekeepers of vital global information streams, and these platforms often moderate content based on untransparent content moderation techniques. This imaginably comes at a real cost to free speech and the future of human rights online. Free speech is supposed to empower the oppressed and break existing power structures. Instead, central content moderation is doing the opposite. When all of this is going on, there is also a lot of chatter about the mythical promises that Web3 may usher in for democratizing the internet. As keen observers in this space, we need to look beyond the keywords and examine the need for decentralizing content moderation and breaking down how some of these solutions might play out in our actual life. The goal of this session today is to talk about some of the inequalities and the problems in the power structures about content moderation today, and examine some of the solutions that are already at the table or are being discussed. With this, I'd like to pose an activity to the participants out there. My question to you is simple. What do you think? What comes to your mind when I say democratizing the internet or democratizing social media platforms? What comes to your mind? Do you have instances to share about how you felt the power structures of the internet were unfair? Or could you tell us about, in your particular part of the world, how will a more democratic way of the internet functioning change your life and the lives of journalists, activists, and other users of the internet? So while you chat, put your answers in chat, I'd maybe put forth the questions to our 3 wonderful speakers. My first question, and please feel free to come in, whoever would like to, but do you feel there is a problem and there is a need to decentralize content moderation? And what do you feel are the tangible and intangible effects of the centralization of power structures as they exist today?
It's a panel of women, so women are usually like, I'll let someone else go first.
I know, that's exactly. I know. I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. Julie?
No, Kate, please.
Maria?
I'm happy to go first or second, or third even.
I will just say that I don't want to answer that was an excellent provocation, and thank you so much, Raghav, for putting together a wonderful panel, and for all of your organization and putting this together. I think, as Julie was saying before the call, it is really hard to do this across time zones and spaces, and you did an excellent job. And so it's a joy to be here. It's my first RightsCon, so that it makes it especially awesome. But I will just say that to answer your kind of provocation, then like your secondary question, like I want to start with the what do you think that it means for there to be democratization? Because I actually think that kind of central to your second question that you posed to us was this idea of decentralization that becomes a proxy for democracy. And decentralization is like just not a proxy necessarily for democracy. In fact, I would say that that is a very dangerous mode to get into thinking. And I think that's one of the reasons that Web3 has been taken up in such a way by kind of techno-libertarians, especially fiscal libertarians or things like that, that there is this kind of mode in which they can both justify it from a small d democratic sense, and then also from like a fiscal sense, like they can make money off of it. But I think that actually the making money off of it is very, very problematic in a bunch of ways. And I actually think that and I'm talking in this sense about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and like stablecoin and all these things, but then moving away from kind of that into ways in which that we're not talking about currency, Web3 and blockchain can be potentially utilized, which I think is actually really vanishingly small from a practical standpoint, and certainly not maybe the way that one democratizes for content moderation. But I would love to hear Julie Maria's take on this.
In fact, I knew I had to listen to Kate first, because I think she made some excellent points, which I hope we will dig further into the discussion, which is we should start with this assumption that the technical decentralization will solve all the democratic problems. We've had that techno-solutionism so many times in the recent past, and we see how efficient that is to say, not efficient. So I hope decentralization, the technical decentralization is not a proxy for not addressing the very real challenges that our societies and our world is facing. Now, with that said, I would respond to yes, there needs to be a decentralized, but in the literal sense of the term, that is to say, there needs to be a sharing of, first of all, information. That is the major problem here. There is an asymmetry of information. On the one hand, we have, of course, the big tech companies, given the incredible trust that we place in them with our very, very personal information. They know a lot, and they harness that, while at the same time, citizens are being kept out of the conversation, especially on the content moderation issue, or are being included in it as if it were something so complex. So it is complex. I'm not saying it's not complex, but I'm saying that it was so complex that no, citizens do not need to chime in. We need to leave this for companies and governments to tell us what the solutions are. We need to leave it to billionaires to tell us what those solutions are. No, this is not true. I think many of the problems that we're seeing here had been alerted to us by a lot of citizens, specifically citizens from the fringes, as we call them, from the margins, minorities. When we talk about LGBTQI Facebook users, they can tell you, they've been telling us for the past 10 years, what was the problem with harassment? What was the problem with doxing? We can ask women, we have 3 here, we can ask women here about violation of Twitter policies or violation of community standards on Instagram, or over censorship. Nipples are not allowed. Why wouldn't I be able to show myself breastfeeding my son, something absolutely normal? So yes, we need to decentralize. And most importantly, we've heard from several whistleblowers, including Frances Haugen or Sophie Zhang. We've heard about the disproportions in terms of investment, in terms of interest from the platforms themselves, the big tech platforms, the content platforms, and specifically Facebook and Instagram, which are the ones on which where those two whistleblowers used to work. But I would even say from media itself. There is less attention on the Ethiopian conflict, for instance, than there is on the Ukrainian conflict. But if we had paid attention to that conflict, if we had paid more attention, closer attention to the conflict, media attention to the Myanmar conflict and the content implications of those specific conflicts, there are lots of learnings that we could have gotten. There are lots of pressures that we could have placed on social media platforms that would have prepared us better for what happened recently in Ukraine. So all this to say, yes, there needs to be a literal decentralization of content moderation, of the creation of the rules of content moderation, of content governance. I hope we can shift the conversation there, because moderation is just symptom, it's after. But the rules are extremely important, and we don't talk about those, and we don't know who are making those. It's really unclear how those are being made. I hope that's going to change. We're going to have a lot of sessions about content governance at RightsCon this year. So we need more decentralization, literally on that sense. And yes, decentralization from a technical perspective is not a panacea for democratic challenges.
Wow, what a kickoff in less than 10 minutes. Thank you for this great points you raised, Kate and Julie. I'm going to add a couple of additional elements that might add my specific perspective. But first of all, let me introduce myself, because I appear, I've seen it, I appear on the agenda as Barbara Bukowska, but I'm actually one of her colleagues. So I'm still with Article 19 and part of the loan policy team, but I had to step in for Barbara the very last minute. She couldn't make it today, unfortunately. Anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. So thank you for including me in this great conversation. I couldn't agree more on the need to clarify what we mean when we talk about decentralization, and not to use this as a proxy for democracy. And I'm absolutely all in for what concerns trying to avoid this dichotomy and try to go always for techno-solutionism. I'm also extremely sensitive to a number of other points that have been raised, such as the investment, a disproportionate investment, which I would call possibly discriminatory in its impact on the different communities around the world. But just let me start with the main point. I do believe that the decentralization of content moderation is needed, not from a technical perspective, but from a power perspective. So what we see today is that there are we all know there are very, very few players that control the flow of information on society. And this is an essential issue for democracy, but is a power issue. The international framework for free expression and for media freedom, media pluralism and independence, those contain a number of prescriptions for states to put in place guarantees to avoid that they can control the communication infrastructure, the flow of information in society. But this kind of rules, the international human rights law on those elements, they don't target private actors. For the private actors, the only thing we have, broadly speaking, is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are principle-based and are pretty generic in a way, and they're not mandatory. So we need to rely on the goodwill of those companies. Yet, those companies have a huge amount of power on our communication infrastructure. So there is a sort of a gap, although a variety of players now, they're trying to fill this gap with regulatory solutions, or being this with additional policies and multi-stakeholder initiatives, etc. But this is still the problem. So we can try to have guidelines that derive from the guiding principles and are more specific for content moderation. This is all welcome, and it's absolutely needed. But we also have another framework, another legal framework that traditionally deals with concentration of power on the markets and addresses private power, which is antitrust rules, anti-monopoly rules. So I do see a huge potential nowadays to step back and look at both those frameworks and try to figure out how the complementarity between the two, rather than consider them as, silos and something to deal with in completely separated environment, and that they can, achieve completely separated goals. I think that nowadays it's pretty evident they're complementary tools, and both needs to be used and used properly, possibly everywhere, because this is a global problem. Before I just leave the floor for the next point, I just wanted to stress once again that I couldn't agree more that there is an issue of disproportionate attention dedicated to certain communities and not to others. which some adds up on this power issue. There is a huge amount of content that needs to be moderated today. This is, not a novelty for anybody. And the automated system that are put in place are imperfect and far from satisfactory. Yet the majority of investment today are based on a specific language and a specific context, a specific community, or a group of communities, which is very limited, and the rest of the world is treated as a second choice or third choice, and this creates a huge disparity and discrimination, as I said earlier, in terms of how the free expression of those communities is protected. So if we talk about global standards and we want to aim at global standards for content moderation, we need to absolutely address this huge gap as well.
Thank you, everybody. We've got an interesting comment that I thought I should read out. We've got Dirk, who says that I feel like society has been like a frog in boiling water in terms of losing their rights to their content. It feels like the water is boiled and it's now frog soup that the tech giants are now dining. A very powerful point that I think there is consensus on is decentralization is not a proxy for democracy. And if we keep that as a framework for the rest of the discussion, Maria, towards the end of her point, spoke about the use of antitrust rules. My question was to Kate. Kate, in your recent article titled Big Speech, you talk about how this often talked about idea of breaking up big tech using antitrust rules might not translate into the kind of positive impact on online speech. And might not address many of the problems of the digital public sphere and the public courtyard, so to say. Could you tell us more about that idea? And I would love to hear Maria and Julie's opinion on that as well.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this in this context, specifically because a lot of the feedback, and I'm presenting it, I'm in Europe right now, and I'm presenting it in a number of places in Europe in the next couple of days. And this is one of my I think the necessary things that scholars should do going forward. And it's really actually like there's actually funds for it, and like there's ways to do it, but it's really great if you can spare the time. And like, I know it's very, very difficult, especially, but like maybe with Zoom and things, it's become more de rigueur to like go and present your paper that you're like all of these like implicit biases that you have coming from a specific geography, a certain language, a certain life experience, like a certain race or gender, and like going to antagonistic places or places that not even are antagonistic, but just very different. It's been like one of the best things with opportunities like this are wonderful. And the paper is from a very US perspective of antitrust. It comes specifically from kind of Lena Khan's neo-Brandeisian new antitrust kind of movement in the US, which draws on kind of a Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice and a public intellectual in like the early 1900s, and who created a lot of the privacy law in the US, like, or influenced it a lot through either his jurisprudence or his academic writing. But the idea is one that speaks back to the idea of power, which is, I think, something that it has a lot of cachet right now. I think it's also like for good reason, like there is like this consolidation of power. We've talked already about these 6 groups of like giant tech companies. And we're not even talking, by the way, about kind of like, and we're talking about competition kind of in a sloppy way, not blaming anyone, but like just kind of like generally people do this. There's like a dialogue about competition, anti-competition, antitrust law that is like kind of not precise and is mostly about attacking bigness or power or kind of consolidation or mergers or acquisitions, and talking about new entrants. But I think increasingly, I guess my take is that even though in the US we see all of these are a lot of these are US companies, I would say with the exception of TikTok, they're all US companies. But TikTok is actually a super interesting countervailing point, because in the FTC v. Facebook suit right now, TikTok is excluded as competing with Facebook because according to the FTC, TikTok is not geographically competing with Facebook. But of course, we kind of know that's not true. Right? Like, in fact, we know that TikTok came on the scene from being ByteDance. TikTok came on the scene in 2017. Within 3 years, it had gained the same number of followers or the same number of users, 3 billion as Facebook. That is like a pretty strong countervailing point to the idea of Facebook's entrenchment as a service. That said, there are other things that Facebook is doing that is so dangerous, which are separate, but no one is talking about, which I think make a much stronger case for antitrust, which is that they are doing things like zero rating services and have been doing these in areas for years. And so you have zero rating services. You truly have the full stack of like people are dependent on something for the internet. It is the nightmare that people think they're living in America, but they're not. And like there is kind of, this is happening for most of Africa and especially India and like rest of world content. And I think that this is actually super, super damaging. Here's what is happening in the conversation about this in America is nothing. Like no one is talking about this. No one understands zero rating in America. Almost nobody is talking about it. No one knows it. Julie, like, am I right? Like, I feel like this is like, I hope it's not just me, because I feel like I'm in some good progressive conversations, but like there's all of this talk about kind of the anti-competitive nature of these things. And I'm like, you are so like US regulators to my mind are so eager to be like, oh no, TikTok's fine. TikTok's totally separate. TikTok's this thing. And I'm like, no, you are like ignoring the global governance and the global marketplace and the global users that you're influencing with your individual policy in the same way that maybe people would complain about that. Not me, but maybe other people would complain about that with Europe. And so like, I think that there's something to be said for that in this moment. And that's kind of a little bit what this piece is about, or that's coming out. And it's, but that is kind of what I'm trying to push back on some of these ideas that we are looking for this way out, especially in US law, in antitrust. And I don't think it's going to give us that, the answer that we want.
On free basics and Kate's excellent remark, there is a paper that was published, I think in 2019 by Dr. Toussaint Nautilus from Stanford University, who did a technical analysis of where Facebook, what's the name? Free Basics, the equivalent of zero rating for Facebook. Well, Free Basic is available in Africa because even that information, or around the world, even that information is not public, which is mind-boggling and speaks to the level of, yes, we tend to think that whatever happens in our immediate environment is what matters, when actually you could learn so much more if you decentralized a bit your perspective and point of view. On your initial question, Raghav, with regards to whether or not antitrust is a solution for the content challenges, for me, the question is even beyond that. Even once you have antitrust, imagine we break all of these big groups, right? And that we have more groups where we can have different forms of moderation, all right? The problem remains of, the reality is that harmful content does circulate on various platforms and does exploit vulnerability of each platform. So imagine a world where we have 200 social media platforms. That means harmful content would have 200 potential ways to adapt to vulnerabilities that exist and adapt to a reality, which is that most of these platforms do not have interoperable content enforcement rules. We have that only in one aspect of two aspects of issues, which is CSAM, which is children's sexual abuse material, and in terrorism, although even there it's not as perfect as we would hope. But what about the rest? What about being harassed on, not being harassed on Twitter, which is fantastic, but then being harassed on XYZ other platform, is that less worse? I don't know. That's a question to be asked. And that poses the bigger challenge of, actually, what is that democratic way in which we want to deal with harmful content, or whatever definition we want to put in there? What is even harmful content? Can we agree on that on the first hand? Very provocative question. And if we do, yes, what are the values that will guide the enforcement so that we will not have one place where, oh, here the Talibans are allowed to talk, you know, and on the other place, oh no, here they cannot talk. They're a dangerous organization. Can we have at least principles, values on which we agree on, which we will apply to set the rules for content, and which will apply whenever we want to enforce those rules? I think the antitrust conversation forces us to look at things, to take a bit of height, right? And say, okay, if we want to live a world where we have more competition, it's fantastic. But we also have to be aware that harmful content adapts itself to diversity. How do we want to deal with that in a democratic way everywhere online?
Once again, the privilege of coming last and, you know, having the space to react to all this great thinking. I do, I'll try to be selective, otherwise we're not going to move on. I do believe that there is an issue. So I liked very much, Kate, what you said about the zero rating and the fact that has a strong impact so that no one is talking about, and is an impact also in terms of power and the power to control users, because, you know, if they go through that zero rating, then they're locked in a way, so they're not going to move anywhere else. I do believe that there are also a number of other behaviors of those platforms that they have a very, very similar impact. And with Article 19, we have explored specifically the fact that if you're on a social media platform nowadays, you get a number of services as a bundle. So they're offered all together. You have the hosting, you have the content moderation, you have the content curation or recommendation, ranking, how we want to call it. You have the instant messaging. All those, they're offered as one single package, but there is no technical good reason for this. We might discuss, you know, whether this is more or less so for the different services, but they could eventually be provided separately. So one of the possibilities, rather than just thinking about structure of breaking up all these giants and then having new ones arising and replicating exactly the same business model, maybe a possibility could be to try to use some pro-competitive measures that take into account also the fundamental rights aspects and the fundamental rights needs, and create a diversified environment for the way these services are offered, the way these services function. So, for example, now we have, if I go on Facebook, the only solution I have, the only possibility I have as a user is to select the content moderation and the content curation as offered by Facebook. It would be very empowering for users to decide that they want to be on Facebook, but they want to have their newsfeed to be provided by other players. And they could select the players that they like the most, that they trust the most. People might have different sensitivities about what they like to see on their newsfeed. We all know, it was mentioned, this idea of harmful content and whether we can ever agree on what harmful content is. I think no, we won't. We possibly will agree on the fact that we need a case-by-case assessment, and then context matters a lot. So that this cannot be done in a centralized way once again, and definitely not in a centralized and automated way. Maybe this kind of pro-competitive instruments could be used to diversify the environment and empower users and create alternative solutions. Some of them we might come to the conclusion once we experiment them. We might come to the conclusion that they work better than the Facebook own algorithm. Others that they work worse than Facebook algorithm. As long as we're free to change it anytime, I think we're going to be better off as users, as a community of users. On the other side, the point is, yes, if we do have 200 different social media platforms, the content will circulate in 200 rather than just one place. This is why I was telling at the very beginning that I think that those two set of instruments are complementary. Because I'm not advocating for a sort of a antitrust or pro-competitive decentralization of power rather than human rights standard for content moderation, but as an addition to. I think that the good solution could be a compromise between the two. It's also the other way to do so is if we sort of assume that if we have just a limited number of social media platforms, and then we can treat them as sort of public utilities. We can tell them how to do content moderation, then we are better off. But the point will be, who needs to tell them how content moderation needs to be done? how much of public debate there is going to be about this, how much different stakeholders participation there is going to be into these processes. Now we tend to think about the US and the EU as the most proactive places where ideas about this possible solution come up. But we need to also consider the rest of the world and many other different areas where I'm not 100% sure that the best solution would be to put their bureaucrats to tell big companies what to do with the content that circulates in those countries. And so in a way, we need to find a solution that eliminates public control as much as that eliminates private control, excessive control over content, as much as it eliminates or guarantees that there is no public control over this content. I couldn't agree more, though, that it's not as easy and we don't have one-stop shop solution for these problems. Yes.
Thank you, all of you, for those points. A quick silver lining, since we are talking about free basics and net neutrality, if any of the participants are keen on knowing a positive case study where civil society was able to negotiate and advocate against free basics and discriminatory data pricing, you could look at India's example from 2016, where thanks to a sustained civil society movement, the telecom regulatory was forced to come out with some of the strongest net neutrality regulations that exist in the world today. We are talking about interoperability of content moderation, and also what are the principles that could be applicable not just across platforms, but also across jurisdictions. And this brings us to the question of, are international human rights law instruments a basis on which content moderation may proceed? The UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression, David Kai, in 2016 said that this might be a framework. And here at Justicia, we came out with the report last year where we translated how international human rights instruments that are applicable and meant for states be applied into private content moderation. So my question is to all of you, which is, how do you feel, and if at all do you feel, IHRL can be incorporated into the content moderation policies of platforms across jurisdictions? And I'll open this up to all of you, but we'll start with Kate, who also tells me that she has a brief follow-up on the antitrust point.
Damn it. I was just about to tell Maria to go first, so she wasn't constantly like having to go last. But I will say just really quickly, I really wanted to say that there was something that came up in both Julie and Maria's responses that I wanted to kind of emphasize, which is I think a fascinating thought experiment, which is as we're thinking about these problems, if we are talking about our global marketplace and a global governance regime for these platforms at the high level, okay, we're separating this from the zero basics level. I really do think that there's a question of how many fully global platforms do we think there should be in the world? And if they are going to be regulated, who is going to regulate those transnational companies in a fulsome way? I just pose this as kind of just a question to the group. And this is what I've been struggling with, because as far as I can tell, it's TikTok, Facebook, and Google, YouTube, but not even. And there are, and everyone knows that Twitter is the limping horse kind of coming up from behind, really huge in the US and other types of communities, but not as big as these other kinds of major platforms. And Snap looked like it was going to have its moment for a while, and who knows what might be next. But yeah, I think that was kind of what I wanted. That was the follow-up that I wanted to say. And I just was interested in people's thoughts of it. Maybe not now, but if people in the audience or otherwise have thoughts and want to send them to me, or want to talk about this more, I just think it's a super interesting question. If they are going to be utilities, they are certainly not utilities for the US. They're not like the railroads in the US. They're like the railroad, they're like a railroad, an Orient Express that goes also to Toronto and then goes to Memphis. And so it's not these are not we have made protocols in which trains can travel across all those lines, but there's still silos in which those standards don't cross over. And I really also just think that content moderation, the scale of global connection, is a hugely costly process. I use these numbers all the time, but it's like $56. I think people in this audience would mostly know this, but it's $56 per average user in North America that Facebook makes off its average user per month in advertising content. The next closest is $14, which is in Europe. And then of course, like there is like this whole, like, and then it kind of goes into single digits after that for everywhere else in rest of world. And there's like a reason that they're trying to put zero basics into place in places like that is the payoff. It is basically capturing the market in other places that are going to be dependent on it for connectivity. And then eventually doing rate hikes and kind of like bringing this up. And I think that I just think that this is like this huge fairness problem that is not being proactively dealt with. I also don't think that it's necessarily malicious or venal or like capitalistically venal on the parts of the companies. I think that people generally want to be connected to each other and they're doing good by going into a lot of places. But there are all of these problems that are happening from a lot of this and all of this fallout. And the only places that are going to have capacity to be in these environments and with these populations that just spend less and are worth less to advertisers is like the ability to spread costs between North America and places like in the rest of the world. And so it's kind of like, actually North America is subsidizing this, and this is maybe a good thing. Like maybe we shouldn't break them up because maybe this is a good thing for the rest of the world ultimately, but we have to put in some type of like watchdogs or oversight or structures to this, because otherwise it's just like, no one is, I don't think people are talking about this enough. And it is like on the precipice of kind of being ignored and just getting kind of swept under the rug.
Raghav, if I could just jump in to respond to your question on IHA, International Human Rights Law and Standards, and also to respond to some of the audience remarks on dismantling power, but then there needs to be power at some point, and also to link with Kate's excellent remarks and Maria's excellent points made earlier about scaling. Well, okay, I think there is, I was talking about an imbalance. Okay, first of all, why is international human rights law the default setting? Simply because of the structure that Kate rightly reminded of. We are on a space where I lead an organization called Internet Sans Frontières. Okay, at a point we thought it was repetitive to say sans frontières because by definition, internet was supposed to be sans frontières. So that said, we have these instruments that at some point in the history of humanity, I think it's a beautiful story. On top of that, a story that involves a woman who was human rights activist and women's rights activists. I'm thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, but many others who were involved from various countries around the world. Well, we have this instrument where virtually humanity sat down at some point and said, this is what we think human dignity is about, no matter your color, no matter your gender, no matter your sexual orientation. These are fundamental rights that you are entitled to, and no one is allowed to deprive you from those rights. Of course, the no one in question were the states at the time, because in a very traditional Westphalian way, these were the only bodies that could concentrate so much power in their hands. Now we have this incredible innovation that has also been capitalistically interesting for those who got involved and who were able to profit from it at some point. Well, we have big groups who have become influential and who have even surpassed some states. We're talking about companies that sometimes send out messages that should be sent out by states, but they do that simply because the state is unable to send those messages. Emergency messages, when there is a catastrophe, when there is a genocide involving a government that is supposed to protect its population from genocide. Well, a platform like Meta's platform, or a platform like Twitter, or a platform like TikTok become a way for these populations to protect themselves against their own government. So once you say it, of course, international human rights law has to apply to these groups too. Probably not with the same strength, but we must have that's my opinion, we must have a body of rules. We are a society of humans capable of great things, but also capable of the worst. We need rules to know where our limits are and how our limits should look like. So of course, I'm not objective here because I work for a board that tries to embody what Special Rapporteur David Kais wrote in 2016, trying to apply those rules to very real situations that pose themselves on social media platforms today, and specifically Facebook and Instagram. But, and that comes to my second point in responding to some of the remarks here about who are we talking about in terms of power? Well, I personally don't agree with the use of well, we're not just users. I'm not just a user of Facebook. I contribute to that platform. I've been doing so for the past 15 years almost. Tell how old I am. But I've been contributing, and that's the case for many others. And on the same way, my grandmother is contributing from the very remote place of the village where I was born. That is fantastic. That makes the beauty of this tool. And I'm personally very worried when we're hinting to in directions of conversations that seem to suggest that we should have a jurisdictional approach to these problems. If we do that, okay, then let's admit internet is not as borderless as we thought. Let's close everything. Everyone will moderate according to their. No, I personally think that is a dangerous conversation to be had, and that gives voice to some of the most worrying theories that have been put out there by certain regime who would rather profit from a world where we are all isolated from each other and only contextualized in the borders of our countries, of our physical countries. The last point that I wanted to make is, of course, we're not just users, but yet we are in this asymmetry of information that I was talking about, of course, with the companies, but of course also when it comes to North-South interactions, global North, global South, and I don't like that expression. I'd rather use global majority. I've learned it here at Stanford University. Well, we live in a world where, okay, first of all, we don't pay attention to what happens 10,000 kilometers or 2,000 or even 12,000 kilometers from where we are. That's despite the fact that we say we're in a borderless world and globalized space, okay? Secondly, okay, we are RightsCon, we can talk about that. How much support are receiving organizations that are trying to raise awareness on the problems that we're talking about here, that are an organization not located in the global North or the global minority, right? That's a big question to be asked. And that's a question that I'm asking to philanthropists, to funders, being a woman myself and a Black woman leading an organization. I can tell you it's complicated to make your point when you're 5 years advanced. It's complicated when you're LGBTQI and you know what's going to happen, what's going to be the problem, to make your point to funders. That is another asymmetry that we need to talk about. If we want to do the work well, we also need to pay attention to the efforts that are trying to raise awareness in the very countries that we are ignoring. So yeah, I'm sorry, this is coming really from my heart, but I think RightsCon is the best place to do that because RightsCon has been trying to support organization with its means, but it's difficult. It's very difficult to make your point when you're right 5 years in advance and you don't have the right gender and you don't have the right skin color. That's a reality too, to which we should be able to talk and to speak to as a community. So just wanted to discuss that briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Kate, as well. It's very difficult to add on what you already say all the along the rounds. Maybe let me start from this very last point. You used the word asymmetry. I think it's also an imbalance of power and possibilities. So it's a little bit more than just an asymmetry. And I think I couldn't agree more on the fact that we're not just users of those platforms. We are and remain citizens, individuals, people. That's why I was suggesting that empowering solution that could go in the direction of empowering us, sort of emancipate us from this passive attribution of, this passive narrative of users and the platform that decides everything for us, and design a frictionless experience, and we don't need to bother and wonder about anything. So that was more or less where I came from. This gives me the possibility to sort of elaborate a little bit. I do believe that. So the point is, I am to go back to Raghav, your initial question. The point is, I agree with what has been said, what Julia said about this international framework that should apply to those private powers, because they're even more powerful than states, oftentimes. There are two layers, though. One thing is the rules, and one thing is how you enforce them. So the point is that we have a huge gap in the enforcement system. We don't have a watchdog, a global watchdog for private actors. What we need to deal with from a legal perspective, and then we can talk about whether this is still, if this is an anachronistic setting, and if we need to revolutionize this setting or not. But this is what we have today. We have national jurisdiction where you do have the rules, and you have the enforcers for those rules. So if someone violates the rules, you can go after them and try to enforce them, and sanction and impose other kind of measures. At the global level, you don't have this. What we have is the UN system that works as we know it works. So my point is, if this is the situation, and by no means I'm not endorsing this situation, I think it's a huge problem that we have, what could be the solution? So, and this is the way I look at this. The more powerful and the bigger those platforms are, the more we are far away from a setting where we can actually impose anything on them. That's why I do believe that this concentration of power needs to be attacked as well as part of the solution. Now, it's a long way to go, and as I said, there are so many different components that we need to work out on this. But I don't think that we can reasonably think that we're going to have a super powerful watchdog that is going to impose rules on private actors everywhere in the world. So that's why a more diversified environment to me looks better. And also, I'm not suggesting that we need to lose these big platforms as a unique space where people from everywhere in the world, they can meet and they can share information. What I'm trying to figure out is a system where we can decide how to compose our own online experience on those platforms. So what we need to do, for me, is to try to diversify the services that I can receive on those platforms without being forced to abandon the platform. I do see the positivity of having these network effects and this, this scale and scope. The point is whether this needs to be either black or white. Either we take it all or we abandon it all. I do believe there is an underexplored middle ground there that we might want to work out.
And just to say something really quickly on that, like I think that what you're articulating, Maria, and I think that's a lot of what Julie's excellent kind of like speed, like talk just said, was basically this idea that like what you just said between like the difference between rules and enforcement is a philosophical question of the rule of law that has existed for literally the entire, like, is law the rule or is law the enforcement? Is like, and that is like, that is like, it's a question of force, right? Like who holds the force? Like who holds that? And this is like, and so what you're basically saying is we need a standardization to high enough level of protocols that there is no type of like, you can get the service, even if you're kicked off, like you can get a similar, like comparable service, even if you can't. You know, like if Tide decides, like, sorry, Tide is a brand of laundry detergent in the US. If Tide decides that I can't buy Tide anymore and I need to go use Bounty, like there's Bounty, like it's comparable. And my like little like grocery store might run its own version of like laundry detergent that I can get, right? And like I can get it, like, but that's kind of this like the idea of consumer. The difficulty in all of this comes from the consumer versus like a listener speaker perspective and the rights that become associated, not as a consumer, but as a speaker listener, which go towards the human rights component that David Kay talks about.
Thank you. we've got a very, so first of all, I have to point out that there's a lot of support for just what Julie said about the disparity between the global minority and the global majority, and how a lot of the conversations about the global majority are centered and placed within a global minority, often without context. So there's a lot of support for that. There's a very interesting comment that is coming from Ben, and Ben talks about, could regulation mandate transparency on the proportion of users of each language to the human content moderators working in each language? Also, the proportion of users of each language to the monetary investment in content moderation, safety of each language. Since we've started with Kate for this entire conversation, let's throw it open to Maria. And Maria, in your work at Article 19 as focusing on digital markets, if I could add to that question about regulation, do you feel with the DSA and with the DSA's focus on ensuring transparency, do you feel the increased transparency obligations actually make it harder and more expensive for smaller platforms to emerge and compete with big tech? Do you feel in the long run, these increased transparency measures will actually harm the level playing field? Not that it exists today, but will it harm that further in the future?
Okay, well, a few points here. First of all, I wouldn't assume that we all talk about the same thing when we say transparency. I wouldn't even assume that if we look at different regulatory framework that suggest or impose transparency, they're referring to the same set of things. And I'm pretty sure that big platforms have played a lot with this, margin of discretion on how to interpret this. I do see among the community of scholars, especially, that there is quite some attention about this topic. And then, different people that are trying to come up with specific, concrete definitions or suggestions about, what transparency means and what we need to know and in which format. Because, for example, for the algorithms that are used by these social media platforms for content moderation, specifically, there's been a lot of talking about, we need transparency about how this works, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need the data to be provided in a way that people can actually work with those. So some scholars are developing this idea of observability rather than just pure transparency. So you need to be transparent in a way that I can actually observe what your algorithm produces, and then I can, try to assess whether this complies with certain values and standards that we want to have. So this is the first thing. Now, having cleared this premise, which is different from having defined transparency, I realize the DSA specifically. We need, once again, we need to go back and wait a little bit and see how this is going to be implemented in practice, all those provisions. I do believe it's not going to be a huge problem of creating disparities and extra burden on small players. First, because there is a specific exception about the very, very small players. They're not supposed to feel obliged by those rules. And then because the DSA has this system of asymmetric obligations, so very large online platforms are going to have additional burdens when it comes to the transparency linked to the risk assessment systems and so on and so forth. Now, there will be the situation where smaller players will suffer a little bit more in terms of capacity and costs in order to comply with those transparency mechanisms. But maybe what we need to figure out is transparency is a huge problem in each and every market. In this one specifically so because it's so linked with the exercise of our fundamental rights and especially free expression. So the point is, as a society, what's the trade-off? Because I do believe that what we need to aim at is to create a meaningful transparency on those markets, irrespective of whether this is going to have more or less impact in the competition dynamic. We need to find a way to ensure that those markets are transparent and eventually also address this competition impact, but not at the expenses of transparency. I do believe it's too important for society and for individuals to have this. There is also the DMA, the Digital Markets Act in Europe, that provides there is a provision about auditing and the obligation of the gatekeepers to be a little bit more transparent. I do believe so that what I'm trying to say is that the kind of transparency that we need don't come specifically from one rule only, but it's more about the way we think about those markets and the provision of those services. Also, I have to say, and I need to be a little bit more polemic here, the point is how much there is going to what extent we're going to have political willingness to resist to the traditional arguments that go in the direction of IP rights and, the right to keep some kind of information private, because otherwise we're going to damage innovation, we're going to diminish incentives for investments and so on and so forth. I think many times these kind of arguments are instrumentalized. So there, I would invite all of us to be very, very careful and find those. Yeah. Sorry.
Raghav, I won't take much more time because we have only 5 minutes. Just wanted to say that the Oversight Board is participating in a session precisely about what transparency looks like. So I'm happy to elaborate. I'll be there, I think, with with our executive director, Thomas Hughes. So happy to elaborate there, but just wanted to put in here that, well, I'm also leading a lab here at Stanford University, which is called the Content Policy and Society Lab. And what we try to do is to explore whether or not there is this, there is a space for an agreement, an understanding of what it looks like to deal with content in a democratic and rights respectful way. And one of the conversations, multi-stakeholder conversations that we're organizing next week, actually in DC, is on legislative perspectives on transparency and accountability. What does the law say in the EU, the future law, DSA, DMA? What are the positions here in the United States? What are the bills pending? What are the positions outside of this sphere? Because Brazil has legislated on content. India has regulated on content. Nigeria is considering. Are there similar perspectives on transparency that we can take from all of this and have an idea? Yeah, I agree, Kate, but we're open, right? We're researchers. We never know, never have expectations. So just throwing this out there that we should have more conversations, global conversations on, yes, what are the perspectives on transparency? Maybe we should know more about the number of content moderators. I agree with what was said in the chat. That information is essential, especially if you're in a country where allegedly there is a disproportion of investment in content moderation processes. Thank you.
Kate, I'm wondering if you have a final comment before we wind up.
I feel like I've talked a lot, but I'll just say thank you to Priscilla, who is doing the work of making this all come together and be flawless and feed us comments from the live stream. And also, Raghav, thank you so much for a wonderfully run panel. And this has been very fun.
Thank you so much. A big thank you to Priscilla. And I'm just looking at all my notes from all the points that we've made. And I've got so much about decentralization not being a proxy for democracy. We've got points about what transparency means. We've gone over the use of big tech and how it might or might not be helpful. We've gone over so much, and I'm certain that the participants have gained a lot. I have to do a small shameless plug of our report on which this session is based, which is called A Framework of First Reference, using international human rights law as a framework for moderating online content. And we specifically look at hate speech and misinformation. I believe Priscilla has already posted a link of that on the chat. I also urge you to look at all the wonderful work that all our three speakers are doing. And we've also got links and all of that on the session description for you. So thank you so much for joining, all three of you. Thank you to Priscilla for moderating, and thank you so much to all the participants who've given us 1 hour of their time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.